So hello, as always, this is Jonathan Miller with the Hometown Historian channel, and today we're talking about Glenn H. Curtis. He was born in Hammondsport in 1878, early maker of motorcycles and airplane engines. Flew successfully airplanes and hydroplanes here in Hammondsport from 1908 to 1911. This guy is an extraordinary guy. I hope you guys enjoy this video. We go into a lot of the details of his life and his accomplishments. Thanks, everybody. Today we're going to delve into the life of Glenn Hammond Curtis. He was born on May 21st, 1878, and lived till July 23rd, 1930. He was an American aviation and motorcycling pioneer, and he was a founder of the U.S. aircraft industry. He's, in a lot of ways, largely forgotten. In the aircraft industry, you think of the Wright brothers, Boeing. Motorcycle, you think of Harley and the Davidsons, you think of Indian motorcycles. You just don't think of Glenn Curtis a lot of times. And I had made a trip when I was doing the floor work a couple years back, probably in 2019. We used to go up into the Finger Lakes region, and we went up to a town called Bath in south central New York, and right near there is Hammondsport, which is where he did a lot of his work. And so we're going to look a little more into his life and what an interesting character he is. And I'll have a couple sections of pictures from in Hammondsport. They have the Glenn H. Curtis Museum. Really neat place to go. There's tons to do there, tons of aircraft, a lot of motorcycles, a lot of bicycles, a lot of cars, a lot of things that he was in a lot of ways he was a Renaissance man. It really hit on all these different areas, motor building, that type of stuff. They also have a really neat film there that sort of delves into his life. It goes into a little bit we'll talk about a little bit. Him and the Wright brothers did not like each other. The Wright brothers sort of back in that era. When you had with cars, you had with planes, the people that came up with the original idea sort of felt like they owned the entire idea. So anybody else that came up with another plane, they would battle them for patents. So just saying well, we own the patent to the aircraft. When in fact the person that had, Curtis, had developed a completely different type of aircraft, if you will. I mean, they're all airplanes, but the engineering was quite a bit different, more far advanced, that type of stuff. And he really had to battle them for that. It's sort of somewhat similar to what Henry Ford went through. I think it was called AMAC, but they said that they owned a patent to the automobile, and if you were trying to produce automobiles, you had to wind out getting their permission first and then go through a process of paying them royalties for every vehicle you sold. Well, Henry Ford thought that was ridiculous, and he took him to court, and he actually won. And the same thing, very similar, happened with Curtis and the Wright brothers, and it was a really, really ugly circumstance. It was sort of weird because ultimately the Wright brothers and Curtis's aircraft manufacturing companies wound up merging at a point. So let's delve into his life. He actually began his career as a bicycle racer, and that's how a lot of these guys, it's the Davidsons, Harley and the Davidsons did that, Indian motorcycles, Merkel, a lot of them started out with bicycles, and then they're like, hey, we could throw a motor on this and build the frame a little stronger, more rigid, and all of a sudden you had something that you could go around pretty much anywhere in a lot of ways. So it was a pretty cool time of invention. So he started with bicycles and as a racer and a builder before moving on to motorcycles, a lot like a lot of the other guys did. As early as 1904, he began to manufacture engines for airships or dirigibles. In 1908, he wound up joining the Aerial Experiment Association, which was a research group founded by Alexander Graham Bell of the phone business. And that was up in Nova Scotia. And they were, primary purpose was to build flying machines of different sorts, but they did really concentrate. That was a time period when they thought that the dirigibles would be much safer, flying machines and airplanes, because airplanes were renowned for just crash after crash after crash. Curtis actually won a race at the world's first international air meet in France, and he made the first long distance flight in the United States. His contributions in designing and building aircraft led to the formation of the Curtis Aeroplane and Motor Company, which later merged into the Curtis and Wright Corporation. His company built aircraft for the U.S. Army and Navy, and during the years leading up to World War I, his experiments with seaplanes led to advances in naval aviation. Curtis's civil and military aircraft were some of the most important types in the interwar and World War II eras. So Curtis began his career as a Western Union bicycle messenger. He was also a bicycle racer and a bicycle shop owner. In 1901, he developed an interest in motorcycles when internal combustion engines became more available. In 1902, Curtis began manufacturing motorcycles with his own single-cylinder engines. His first motorcycle's carburetor was adapted from a tomato soup can containing a gauze screen to pull the gasoline up by capillary action. In 1903, he set a motorcycle land speed record at 64 miles an hour for 1 mile. And that sort of, we look ahead now and like, oh, 64 miles an hour wasn't a whole lot, but back then that was extraordinary. On January 24, 1907, Curtis set an unofficial world record of 136.36 miles per hour on a 40 horsepower V8 powered motorcycle of his own design. It's cool. That motorcycle they redid. I think there's one at the Smithsonian which is the original, but at the Curtis Museum they have one that they remade just like it. I believe it's that way. It might be the other way around, but the thing is ginormous. Like this engine there, it's one of the most insane things you've ever seen, but it's so cool seeing it. So that is and here they even have the motorcycle is now in the Smithsonian, and so the one that they have in the Curtis Museum is actually a replica, but it's so cool seeing that. But to set that kind of record at that time period was just nuts. And it's funny because the engine is the air-cooled F-head engine was intended for use in aircraft, and he remained the fastest man in the world. The title the newspapers gave him until 1911, when his motorcycle record was until 1911, and then his motorcycle record was not broken until 1930. So pretty cool history with motorcycles that he has. Like, once again, I mean, I do apologize. Some of the pictures are pretty fuzzy in some of these things, but I'll tell you, it was one of the coolest museums I've ever been at, and it just, the amount of, if you enjoy engineering, you enjoy motor vehicles, you enjoy motorcycles, bicycles, like anything of that nature. There's a couple airplanes there, not a whole lot. I think you even have some boats there that I don't have pictures of, but just everything in that regard. Then it has like a recreation of a telegraph office, because he actually I think he worked for the Eastman and Kodak office. It was before it was Eastman and Kodak, but he created some kind of stencil machine, because the guy was brilliant, and he was an inventor, and he invented something else that helped to study photography as well. So even at an early age, he just showed a real knack for being able to look at something that, say, we need something in this area, and able to create and invent that. So really, really cool guy. One thing that came out of him, his racing, is that it strengthened his reputation as a leading maker of high-performance motorcycles and engines. That was sort of the same thing, like you had Indian and Harley Davidson really, really battled each other for long periods of time. And it was one of those things that they did back then, is the racing, the speed records, all those different types of things were very, very important in prestige for their companies, and that was something that Curtis was probably the best at out of all of them. He just is a man that had no fear, and he definitely excelled with motors and with motorcycles and bicycles, and later to come on here with airplanes. So let's go on to the next group of things that he really worked on, which would be aircraft, and sort of his history with that, his history with the Wright brothers, which is essential to the telling of any tales that are told about Glenn Curtiss. So let's head on to the next subject. The Cradle of Aviation. Here, Glenn H. Curtiss piloted the Junebug, July 4th, 1908, I believe is 8. It was the first kilometer flight. So this is the one we'll talk about later in the video. It was, I believe, the Aerodrome 3 that he built with Alexander Graham Bell. Very, very cool with the AEA. So in 1904, Curtiss became a supplier of engines for the California aeronaut Tom Baldwin. In the same year, Baldwin's California Aero, powered by a Curtiss 9-horsepower V-twin motorcycle engine, became the first successful dirigible in America. In 1907, Alexander Graham Bell invited Curtiss to develop a suitable engine for heavier-than-air flight experimentation. Bell regarded Curtiss as the greatest motor expert in the country and invited Curtiss to join his AEA, which is the Aerial Experiment Association. So between 1908 and 1910, the AEA produced 4 aircraft, and each one would be an improvement on the previous one. Curtiss primarily designed the third aircraft, the Aerodrome No. 3, the famous Junebug, and became its test pilot. And this plane is actually, I believe it's the original, but they fixed it up and that's there, and it has like a mannequin there in the seat and everything. It's pretty cool to see it. So he became the test pilot, and he started undertaking most of these proving flights. On July 4th, 1908, he flew 5,080 feet to win the Scientific American Trophy and his $2,500 prize. This was considered to be the first pre-announced public flight of a heavier-than-air flying machine in America. And the flight of the Junebug propelled Curtiss and aviation firmly into public awareness. On June 8, 1911, Curtiss received U.S. Pilot's License No. 1 from the Aero Club of America. Because the first batch of licenses were issued in alphabetical order, Wilbur Wright received License No. 5. At the culmination of the Aerial Experiment Association's experiments, Curtiss offered to purchase the rights to Aerodrome No. 3, essentially using it as the basis of his Curtiss No. 1, the first of his production series of pusher aircraft. He then, in 1910, flew from Albany to New York City to make the first long-distance flight between 2 major cities in the U.S. It was a 137-mile flight, which he completed in just under 4 hours, including 2 stops to refuel. He won a $10,000 prize offered by publisher Joseph Pulitzer and was awarded permanent possession of the Scientific American Trophy. He then, in 1910, provided a simulated bombing demonstration to naval officers at Hammondsport. 2 months later, Lieutenant Jacob E. Fickle demonstrated the feasibility of shooting at targets on the ground from an aircraft, with Curtiss serving as pilot. And 1 month later, in September, he trained Blanche Stewart Scott, who was possibly the first American woman pilot. The fictional character Tom Swift, who first appeared in 1910 in Tom Swift and His Motorcycle and Tom Swift and His Airship, has been said to have been based off of Glenn Curtiss. The Tom Swift books are set in a small town on a lake in upstate New York, so it certainly does make sense. Unfortunately, there was a patent lawsuit that we talked about earlier with the Wright brothers against Curtiss in 1909, and it continued until it was resolved during World War I. Since the last Wright aircraft, the Wright Model L, was a single prototype of a scouting aircraft made by 1916, the U.S. government, desperately short of combat aircraft, pressured both firms to resolve the dispute. Of 9 suits Wright brought against Curtiss and others, and the 3 suits against them, the Wright brothers eventually won. Okay, so it was the Wrights that actually won every case in courts in the United States. But it was sort of like, when you look at it, how they did things back then with patents, it was really, really unfair that somebody could basically say, I own the rights to the aircraft. It was sort of ridiculous when you go back and look at it. But so he did a lot of stuff with, as I said, he was showing how you could land aircraft on water. All these, eventually, I think showing too that you could potentially, if you had like a floating boat that was large enough, you could possibly land aircraft on that. So he came up with a ton of these ideas that would later on in World War II era be used significantly. So one of the planes that he was famous for was the JN-4 Jenny for the Army and the N-9 seaplane version for the Navy. These were both fantastic aircraft that were really, really important during World War I. And he definitely was one of those individuals that contributed highly to aircraft. So another unique thing that he is known for are these four-engine flying boats. They wound up being known as the Curtiss NC, and three of these four NC flying boats built attempted a transatlantic crossing in 1919. Thus, the NC-4 became the first aircraft to be flown across the Atlantic Ocean. And that was a feat quickly overshadowed by the first non-stop Atlantic crossing by the Alcock and Brown. While the NC-1 and NC-3 were unable to continue past the Azores, NC-4 is now on permanent display in the National Museum of Naval Aviation. He eventually stepped down by 1920. It underwent a financial reorganization, and he cashed out his stock in a company, retired to Florida, and basically from there on just served as an advisor. And that was it for his aviation work. So later in his life, after he moved to Florida in the 1920s, he founded 18 different corporations, served on civic commissions, and donated extensive land and water rights. He had co-developed the city of Hialeah with James Bright and developed the cities of Opa-locka and Miami Springs, where he built a family home. In the Glenn Curtiss House, which is known as, after years of disrepair and frequent vandalism, is being refurbished to serve as a museum in his honor. His frequent hunting trips to Florida Everglades led to a final invention, the Adams Motor Bungalow, a forerunner of the modern recreational vehicle trailer, named after his business partner and half-brother G. Carl Adams. Another interesting thing that we talked about, the Wright Aeronautical Corporation, a successor to the original Wright Company, ultimately merged with the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company on July 5, 1929, forming the Curtiss Wright Company shortly before Curtiss's death. He also developed a tailless aircraft with a V-shaped wing and tricycle landing gear that he hoped could be sold in the price range of a family car. So a controversy of note, Curtiss, and this is mainly because of his dislike of the Wright brothers because of all the lawsuits between himself and them, he wound up working with the head of the Smithsonian Institute, Charles Walcott, basically seeking to discredit the Wrights and rehabilitate the reputation of Samuel Langley, who was a former head of the Smithsonian. Basically, they had him secretly modify Langley's 1903 Aerodrome aircraft, then demonstrated in 1914 that it could fly. So basically, they endorsed the false statement that Professor Samuel Langley had actually designed and built the first man-carrying flying machine capable of a sustained flight before the Wright brothers. But ultimately, they made him correct the modifications and then acknowledge that the Wright brothers did deserve credit for the first flight. But it is understandable. So he died on July 23rd, 1930 in Buffalo, New York. He had an attack of appendicitis in court where he had a lawsuit that was brought against him by former business partner August Herring. And ultimately he was buried in Hammondsport, the place of his birth. So it can be said he really was an extraordinary man, and really, in a lot of ways, forgotten, which is a shame because of everything that he accomplished in life. And I'm sure, like with anyone, there were issues from the controversies with the Wright brothers and those types of things. But overall, what he contributed to mankind was phenomenal, and it's indisputable. So this is a guy, if you ever get a chance to check out the museum up in Hammondsport, New York, it's just a couple miles away from Bath, New York. It's a really, really, really neat museum, a neat guy. It's his hometown history that's well worth observing and taking part on and checking out. So, as always, I want to say thank you for coming along, and we will see you all about town.